Hey, folks. Thanks for joining us here another week here at another weekend here at Get Rick Wagner getting it right. Not so tough anymore. Don't even have to be very smart to do it. Anyway, we're here on KGLN, KNZZ, the internet, two or three other places. We really appreciate your dealership, your listenership. And please go to the website if you want to take a look at what the news is and everything. You can get that at the rickwagnershow.com or thewaronwrong.com, and they'll take you there. We're not selling you anything. We're not tracking you, nothing else there, but I got a whole bunch of links there for news, and maybe you can jump off on that. Speaking of news, we just got to keep talking about what's going on. I mean, our job here, at least as I see it, is to try and put a little context into what we're hearing other places where they just sort of talk about them, and then they talk about them again, and then they talk about them again, and you realize that you didn't learn any more from the third repetition of what they were talking about than you did the first time. So we try and be a little more in-depth here because you folks need to have a little more context on this stuff. And that's what's missing all of the time. And, of course, as I'm doing this, I'm assuming we're not blowing anything up in Iran, but, they're not continuing to do that. And but who knows? These change by the minute. Because the Iran thing is really there are two real flashpoints here, which you know what they are, right? There's Iran and the Ukraine. And they both test U.S. deterrence and our strategic clarity. And the question that comes up with people is, are we projecting strength, or are we just drifting around from one problem to the next? In other words, is there an overarching plan here? I think there is. And because I see very clearly what's going on in Iran, the situation in the Ukraine is, when you say heartbreaking, I mean, that's just not something to say. I mean, it's terrible. We're starting year 5 of that war in Ukraine. We're going to be longer than World War II with what's going on in that country. And it's not good for anybody. It's certainly not good for the Ukrainians, and it's not a big plus for the Russians either. But they're not going to give up, at least not as we see now. Anyway, let's talk about what's going on in Iran a little bit, because it's fascinating. We have a military buildup in Iran there that I don't think we've seen in decades anywhere. We have a lot of assets in there. You've probably seen that on the news. They have talked about that. I mean, we have the Gerald R. Ford, the Abraham Lincoln, and their carrier groups, which are a lot of other boats with them. And they're there. They're there, yes. And we also have some, what we think probably some assets, as they like to say, probably some jets and some fighters, that some of the other bases in the area that they don't make a big talk about. But we are signaling, military readiness, and Iran is just not coming around on these talks. The last thing we've heard is that they walked away, and because they removal of excessive conditions. Now, I don't want to see excessive conditions. The problem is their idea of excessive conditions is to leave them alone to do what they want, pretty much. They've been expanding their missile capability. That Midnight Hammer took a lot out of them with their nuclear program. But that stuff can be rebuilt. And whether or not we got all of it, I know the president thinks we got the vast majority of it, but we don't know. If they got out a few truckloads of processed uranium that already had, been enriched, and then they could build up their systems again, and they could get going a lot faster than they'd have to start from square one. And we just flat don't know 100% on that. We certainly destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, but if you built some of the infrastructure and you already had some of the enriched uranium that you were, 75% of the way where you wanted to get that stuff, then that takes the clock and moves it at a different rate. And they think that requiring them to get rid of that, if they have it, is an excessive condition. We think that them having any kind of nuclear device is absolutely unacceptable. So that seems to be kind of the headbutting position there. At the same time, Iran has been trying to expand their missile capability, not just necessarily the nuclear situation, but the capability of their entire armada, as it were, of missiles. They're trying to get longer range missiles with better stability and better targeting. And they're probably getting some help from China and even a little bit from Russia. Because the more problems that are created in another part of the world, the less we can concentrate on what's going on in the Ukraine and what's going on with China. So they're okay with causing a whole lot of tumult. And frankly, the amount of tumult they can create with just a few things given to Iran is, the return on investment for them is pretty high. So they want this capability to be ignored, essentially. The gap in that negotiation is pretty structural. It's not just like, we disagree on the wording. It's a structural problem. And we're sort of entering into what people like to call a coercive diplomacy stage, where essentially we used to refer to this, I think, as gunboat diplomacy in the time of Teddy Roosevelt. And it's backed by force. And we'll see if they think we mean it or if they care. Remember, one of the problems you have with dealing with these people is we have a couple of actors in the world, North Korea and Iran, that are not logical or rational for different reasons. It appears that in North Korea, to hold on to power, and because there's some sort of structural problem with the leadership there, we don't know what they're going to do. And them having a nuclear device is just, the more you find out about how crazy the people at the top are, the more it bothers you. Iran, the people these are not dumb, crazy people. They just have a completely different philosophy about what they want to do. And they really don't care about what our idea about how the world ought to look. They have an idea how the world ought to look, and they're going to make it go that way. So that makes these regional stakes really high. And stability in the Gulf is something we'd like to have, but let's face it, it's not so easy. It's pretty easy to miscalculate. I mean, if deterrence fails with Tehran, the consequences we have, they're not going to stay in Tehran. I mean, that's the thing. And if you're looking at the Ukraine and Russia, I mean, there's been a tactical shift there. I mean, the Russians have been focusing heavily on the energy grid and sort of the infrastructure, even more than they were. They're sort of doing this economic attrition strategy, which means there's a lot of even more civilian casualties. It's an industrial and economic attack. And the civilian resistance is targeted. It's one of those things where they're going to bring the war home to everybody. It's not going to be fought on the battlefield. It's going to be fought, in the street, blowing things up, whatever the case may be. We don't know what to do in the West. It's pretty clear when you read different viewpoints on this, especially if you read the international papers and so forth. Do you just continue funding and weapons? Or as like Victor Davis Hanson says, do you do fight to the last Ukrainian? Is that what's making sense? We don't have any clear end state here. We don't know how, in a mind, or at least no one has articulated it, what does the end look like? We're still sitting talking around it. And it's fracturing the whatever passed for unity with our so-called European allies, because they have different agendas amongst themselves. Some of them based on their trade policies, some of them based on their own internal problems, and some of them based on geographic connections to where the Ukraine is and how far or close that is. And the fact that they've been living under our umbrella for a long time. And, sustained conflicts, they test political will. And we don't know what the political will is, because it's not just the United States. It's Europe and, of course, Russia on the other side, where we think we know what the Russians are doing and thinking and, what Putin's is, but we don't really. It's all guesswork. And I think when we just have an idea about what's going on, and we have some people in mind, they fall off a building or something, and then I don't think that our rationale and our calculations mean anything. So it's pretty murky. We have a generalized idea of what we think maybe Putin and the Russian upper command want, but it's pretty thin. We know what the Ukrainians want. They don't want to be run over, but we don't know what they're willing to give up. Okay, folks, thanks for taking on. Rick Wagner here, getting it right. Still with you here, talking about some things that are in the news that we probably need to get a little more context on. I talk about Colorado stuff periodically, and it doesn't seem to register as well as I would like anyway. But the Colorado legislature is as crazy as anybody in Iran, I think. They're dumber. I think we know that for, if you take it like an average IQ, if you still believe in IQs. And if you look at some of these characters, yeah, the ideas we have had coming out of our Colorado legislature and some of you other folks' legislature out there should worry you about who the heck is in charge in these things. We've always had crooks and the mentally challenged and the individuals who can't get out of their own way in government. It attracts that. But we had a few that kind of counterbalanced that. And we had a little more attention paid by the voting population. Percentages of people that vote, things that, they were looking at, how they wanted the economy to go, what they wanted their Main Street to look like. But now you start seeing things like a Democratic Socialist, let's just say he's a communist, Mondami in New York, and if you look at the amount of people that voted in that New York election, it's pretty thin, percentage-wise. And yet everybody in New York who wasn't just out of their minds knew exactly what he was. And I can't help but believe there wasn't a majority of people, if they were, somehow coerced to the polls to say, you got to vote for somebody, they wouldn't have voted for him. But they just couldn't be bothered. And we kind of have that happening a lot. And pretty soon, the couldn't be bothered thing is going to lead to you being bothered a lot by a lot of things. So those people need to wake up. You guys know this. You need to wake them up. Friends, neighbors that have good head on their shoulders that are just not participating, they better start participating. Otherwise, participation is going to start happening to them and you. So anyway, getting back to some of the other stuff we can talk about. This Cuba boat thing was kind of interesting. Supposedly, there was some sort of armed confrontation here in Cuban waters, which is always difficult to say what that might be. And some of the Cuban forces, the Cuban, what we would call their version of the Coast Guard, fired on a boat that was registered to Florida, an owner there. Apparently there were 4 fatalities. There's some wounded. U.S. citizen looks like that was killed. Look, we already have some pretty high U.S.-Cuba tensions because, remember, we're cutting their oil off. Cuba doesn't have any oil. So they were getting it from Venezuela. And we've been curtailing a lot of that. So their ability to get oil in for fuel and other purposes has been drastically reduced, and it is not going well for them because of that. And we're not exactly talking about a thriving economy to start with. So things are pretty tripwired there. Now, we've pretty much got a blockade going. Not a announced blockade, but that's what it feels like. It certainly feels like that to the Cubans. And they like to bring up the Bay of Pigs invasion. Remember this with under JFK, where we didn't support, like apparently some people promised, some expatriates trying to land back on Cuba and take it back over, and it was just a terrible situation. And so they keep referencing that, like, well, the Americans are trying to do this again. I don't think we're trying to do anything again like that. I think we're trying to just cut them off until finally people wake up and say, not having any money, not having any fuel, and happen to keep cars that were manufactured in 1958 running forever is just not the way we want to live. At some point, choices have to be made by them, and we're trying to highlight that, right? And we've always had these maritime clashes with them because they're so close to Florida. We bump into each other all the time. The bigger question is, was this some sort of rogue action? Was it just a boat full of people that wanted to get too close and, shake their fist at the island? Was this some kind of covert activity, either sanctioned quasi by the government or just something that a bunch of people got together because they watched too many movies and thought they were going to do? And did that make some sort of escalation risk? We don't know completely yet. And it just shows how quickly anymore that this kind of localized violence can become sort of a diplomatic situation. That's what it's become. Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, has said that we'll be dealing with this. And he didn't say it in a way that was like, well, I think we're going to send them a strongly worded letter. I think that Washington, from what I read, when I read some of these other sources, are still trying to figure these things out that you and I are talking about. Who were these people? What exactly were they trying to do? Who was behind it, if there's anybody behind it? And what are the circumstances? I think that from what you read is I think the United States is pretty flat-footed about this incident. We don't really know a lot about it. And so you get these small incidents in tense regions, they escalate fast. And you need clarity. Deterrence is all about clarity. If this happens, then that happens, right? Fool around and find out what happens next. Well, to do that, you have to have some clarity. And when we're not clear on events and what's happening, who's sponsoring them, if what we're hearing is correct, it makes sloppy diplomatic exchanges. And it not because you want them that way, but you don't have a position that you can talk about things from. So they're really scrambling out there to see who are these people, what happened, what was going on, who was behind it, if anybody, like I said. And, you know, it's kind of abstract to some people, but it affects Americans, you know, at least indirectly or directly if you're in Florida or if you have people and relatives that live in Cuba, which a lot of people in Florida do. And this idea that you don't know what's going on exactly, just have an event, and you're clearly not aware of the people involved, doesn't make it any easier. So we got to watch that. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. At the same time, right here at home, there's this big push about, fraud. Certain people stealing your money, by the way, to do things, that we would like to see them do. Buy expensive houses and cars and go on trips and buy jewelry for their, boyfriends or girlfriends, whatever, all kinds of things we'd like to see them do with tax dollars. Yeah, that seems to be a lot of that going along. Minnesota seems to be a hotbed of it. And when you look at the political leadership in Minnesota, you realize that, well, who's going to stop it? I look at my state here, Colorado, and I have kind of the same feeling. I mean, their priorities are nowhere near this idea of like, we need to be watching our money. No, that's not really out there. And Minnesota is the same way. So the feds have been withholding some Medicaid funding. I think it's around, 200? I got the number written down here, $259 million last I checked, because of all these allegations of fraud and misuse. And they don't want to give them this money until they have some sort of plan submitted to say, look, we clearly have fraud, abuse, embezzlement, whatever you want to say, and we got to hear something from you to make sure this stops. And, of course, the answers we get from a lot of Minnesota officials are, this is an attack on Minnesota, this is racist, this is, I don't know what it is. It's, Tim Walz is, the fact that he's a governor and could have conceivably become vice president is amazing to me. It's not a good sign, is it? And so there's a lot of these entitlement programs that aren't getting funded. Now, there are people there who actually need it, but you can't, from the outside, decide how to do that. So that's what's happening. It's just sitting there, and these guys are arguing about things that are not structural. They're ideological. And that's not going to get anything solved. And there's always this question of federal oversight versus state autonomy, right? The state leadership pushes back. What does federalism mean anymore? We can't even say, especially the Minnesota issue. Look, according to Minnesota, that you're not supposed to be enforcing federal law with federal officers in a sovereign state. Sovereign is the, I guess, key word there. What does that mean in terms of the United States and your constitutional position within it? They're very Confederacy sounding, if you listen to what they're saying. They've got this mix of state sovereignty, states' rights, this and that. They dance around the 10th Amendment, but not really, because they don't have any ground to stand on. If they try and pull a constitutional rabbit out of the hat and say, well, it's just the 10th Amendment here. Yeah, well, the 10th Amendment specifically says that powers not granted to the federal government should be retained by the states. Immigration control is specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So they don't like the 10th Amendment as an argument for that. They talk around it. And it's clear that the real come out there is we don't want you to do anything in our state because we're doing something else, and we, A, don't want you to find out about it, and B, we would be embarrassed about it, except we don't have the good sense to be embarrassed about it. But the whole thing is, look, if a government can't police its own spending, why should the citizens trust it anywhere else? I mean, is that a difficult situation? We got to see this resolved. Okay, folks, I wanted to have our last segment here about something that is in the news now and then again, and I think it's unfortunately a real insight into world affairs. It's something that is mentioned, but not talked about. But I think is something that could come to a lot of places if things aren't done properly, and that is Britain has, and there's an election going on over there that they're hopefully trying to get some sense into their government, if that's still possible. I'd be the first to say, or I'm not the first to say, but I would be among them to say that I'm not certain that Great Britain or the United Kingdom is going to survive in its present form or recognizable form a lot longer if they don't change some things. It's just not going to happen. The governmental structure over there is going in all different directions. And speech is being suppressed in very noticeable and, frankly, unsettling ways. The law, as it is in Britain, seems to be favoring entirely different groups of people. In other words, the law is not supposed to favor anybody. If you are there and you're a citizen and you've been there a year, or your grandparents go back to writing back with Henry II, the law should treat your actions pretty much the same. None of that seems to be happening in Britain now, and people know that. And when that pillar starts falling, and we feel it falling in the United States, when it starts falling as heavily as it is in Britain, you wonder how long things can hold up. They've had a series of just miserable prime ministers and governments. And remember, they don't have a constitution like ours or anything like it. It's just sort of a mishmash. They had the Magna Carta, but boy, that was a long time ago. And since then, it's all just sort of a bunch of different documents and government positions, and they can kind of still do kind of what they want. So Parliament can make a lot of speech that we would find objectionable, illegal, or a speech that we think is, just the way people are when they get mad and doesn't hurt anybody except makes the person look bad, also illegal. And you can have your constabulary spending a lot of their time chasing people down for posting things on the internet and seeming to ignore much more serious crimes because they seem to be committed by groups that are, if not favored, it's in the ruling class's interest to ignore. Now, if this starts sounding a little familiar to you about what happens in the United States, then we need to listen up. Now, one of the things that comes out of Britain now that it's heartbreaking, like I think I've used that the second time I've used that today, and it's disturbing, is what's going on with the interaction between some of these recently arrived migrants and a lot of the young women in Britain. Some of this interaction that is problematic arises because of very different cultural norms, which makes it sound very clinical in terms of how people interact with the opposite sex, what they think of of the opposite sex who don't agree with them on religious or other factors, and does that dehumanize them because they don't agree with you? And it brings to light a clash of civilizations. And it's no fun to have a clash of civilizations in your front yard. And for a lot of Britons, that's kind of what's happening. And you may have heard about the grooming gangs scandals, right? I mean, it's not a rumor. It's not an internet conspiracy theory. There are multiple official investigations in the United Kingdom that confirm systemic abuse of these young women. How does it go on for as long as it apparently has? Decades now, getting worse. Well, it seems to be some sort of weird institutional incentives that we need to watch. I mean, here's some things. Between 1997 and 2013, Rotherham, a city a moderate-sized city, big town in Britain, had 1,400 victims of sexual trafficking, things of that nature. There's similar networks in some of the surrounding communities, Rochdale, Telford, and the victims are often teenage girls in state care or unstable homes. Does that sound familiar at all? I mean, the bus stations used to be the sort of quintessential idea that people had about where young people get victimized when they run away from home or things like that. Well, that's sort of what's happening here, except that the people that are victimizing them are living a lot closer to them than that. They don't have to travel far, and they're lots of times coming from families that are unstable, right, as we said, who are receiving a lot of federal assistance because things aren't going well for them. And so we've seen in Great Britain this organized grooming of mostly these girls, and then intimidating them and people around them, and then trafficking them, as we like to say now, which I think is I think it's a euphemism. Sex trafficking, it's getting used for everything now. I mean, it used to be, and I don't want to sound crude here, it used to be pimping, right? Now it's sex trafficking. It's using some other person's work, as it were, to further your own economic ends, either moderately against their will or through coercion, or even through illegal acts like drug addiction and things like that. And it's ugly. And what's been proven in Britain right now, it's been sustained. There's a pattern of this exploitation. It's not isolated criminality that's going on over there. In many instances, victims of this apparently have reported assaults and have been ignored. What does that do if you're facing government? And the official reports are disturbing because you get a sense of what is going on pretty quickly from listening to the people's reports. And then you read the way that the government is responding, especially the police, and the response seems so incongruent that it becomes even more disturbing. They like to say that some of these victims, what happened was consensual. Okay, that's a big long word there for some things. Social services will flag some of these risks repeatedly, but nothing happens. A lot of the people in charge of this stuff in the government who might take action are in fear of being labeled as racist or as inhibiting, community groups or in the action against them. And that somehow the cohesion of the community that seems to be associated more often with this, whichever what it is, influences the decision making. It isn't that the officers themselves were monsters, but that they were institutionally risk averse. And that sounds like a very light word, doesn't it? Oh, they're risk averse. Well, it becomes a pretty big, heavy term when it comes to enforcing the law, where you're becoming more afraid of the repercussions of taking action that you think is within the boundaries of the law because of outside pressures societal ideas, political maneuvering, whatever the case may be, if that's what's making you risk averse in law enforcement and allowing people to be damaged rather than take any risk, they need to find a job. That's just my opinion. But that seems to be going on. When you're enforcing the law, when enforcing the law becomes some sort of politically risky idea, then not enforcing it becomes some sort of politically convenient thing for other people. That shouldn't be happening. The institutions in most places, this isn't just Britain, you see them everywhere, certainly within the West. The incentives for institutions of all sorts that encounter anything like this, where there is interaction between communities that are singled out as being, oppressed, this or that, and if you believe they're acting out against others, the incentive there is to avoid scandal, try and push down any tension between these groups and everyone else, not make any big headlines anyplace, and of course, the leading thing, don't damage your career. So these things happen, and people in charge go along to get along. It's a case study in bureaucratic self-preservation. And the next layer of that is, how do these bureaucracies get so strong that they can endure this? How can they get so strong that doing the wrong thing in the bureaucracy so that you don't get a wrong, in your mind, headline or a headache for your superiors because you're reporting problems in their area and they don't want it to look bad, or that it creates some kind of tension between them and the constituency? That's a layer of bureaucracy that is what you're trying to avoid everywhere, isn't it? It's the inmates running the asylum a little bit. Britain has been leading this for a long time, and we have ignored it. Britain has a permanent civil service that we think we have a deep state. They've had a deep state for about 100 years, practically. There are very few officials that work under ministers, cabinet-level officials, it would be in our country, things like that, that are not seriously protected from any kind of corrective action or replacement. And they go along with the sort of institutional ideas that are in their bureaucracy, not what the elected officials necessarily want to do. And they're quite open about saying that, ministers come and go, but we remain. The idea at first was, well, we can't be replacing everybody every 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years, right? We have some continuity there. That was what the whole idea was. And it's the same idea that we have in our country. Is you don't just turn the wheel and everybody that was working for 4 years changes to another group of people working for 4 years. Because it takes them 3 years before they get competent in their job, maybe. So it's not like there's an easy answer to that. The answer is to have some pretty hard and fast guidelines about how people handle certain situations and not let the bureaucracy decide how it's going to be run. We see that in the United States in some of the teachers' unions and so forth. What they want is they want to choose the people that are their bosses. And then they want to have the political power to make those people they choose as their bosses do what they say. And many times they're successful. And a lot of that happened successfully, if you want to call it a success, in Great Britain. System over there, they prioritize their reputation management over how well they're managing things. As far as they're concerned, bad optics, as we like to say, which I never would, outweigh bad consequences. That's, when you see that happening, it kind of sneaks up on you. But think about where that leads. You get a system that's protecting its image, and in this case, before it protects its own children. Now, the leadership right now, Keir Starmer, he was the director of public prosecutions during part of this period. And he apparently did very little to stop this grooming and this sex trafficking with at-risk children, young women in Great Britain that was being fostered by gangs predominantly of people of immigrant descent or recent arrival. Dragging his feet apparently is not even a good enough analogy. Everyone felt like, well, not everyone, but people looking back on it now think, well, the Crown Prosecution Service moved too slowly. Well, it's more than that. The prosecutions just lagged. And like what we see in some of our cities here is if you do have a good officer who makes a valid arrest and the prosecution screws around with it and doesn't do anything with it, at some point people stop making those arrests for a couple of reasons. One is they're not feel like they're accomplishing anything. The other thing is they start getting in trouble because they keep putting things in the system that the system would rather avoid. So pretty soon good officers, good investigators, detectives, people like that, if they don't have good prosecution, just stop. Because not only do they not get anything good out of it, but they get stuck, right? To where what they're doing is adverse to their own behavior, to their own reputations, right? And we see that in this country, but we're able to see it writ large in Britain, and we should be paying attention to it. Their system isn't exactly like ours, obviously, because we talked about Constitution, things like that, but it's close enough to where it ought to make us really think. Same thing in France. These are structural problems. These are not necessarily personal attacks. So Keir Starmer seems to be sort of a dish rag in the world of law enforcement prosecutions, but nevertheless, he's a product of this structure. And when you start to control those public debate about problems that are going on with ethnic groups and how they're impacting others, when you don't want to hear about that, and you start having social and professional consequences for, saying something bluntly that we in the United States we would say, that's the downhill slide, right? So, why should we care? Well, if citizens believe crime data is filtered through politics, then there isn't any trust. And don't we feel like that in the United States right now? Don't we feel like that most of the statistics and things that we receive anymore are getting filtered in a way that we have no choice but to question them? That is something we're seeing, I think, pretty easily. And we should care, because we're having immigration debates here. No surprise, right? We all know that. And we see this collision in decision-making between law enforcement and what many people think about DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, and however you want to frame that. And we're also starting to see the more institutional protection than a concern for public safety. We're not Britain, but we seem to be heading in that way. I mean, don't you think our institutions are headed towards behaving that way under the similar pressure? It sort of feels like it. I mean, a government's primary job is equal enforcement of the law. And there's a whole raft of reasons for that. One, I mean, it seems objectively, morally, and ethically what ought to happen. Secondly is, if you have a society where that's not felt, where the law is not the same for thee than me, you're starting to drive wedges between groups of people that are very difficult to mend. people start thinking, and we've always thought that certain people get treated better. I mean, Voltaire said that the law was like a spider web, that it caught the small, but the big ones flew right through. So it's not a new idea. This is something you got to think about all the time. That when cultural political calculations distort the duty to enforce the law equally, then who gets who pays the cost for that? Who really endures that? Well, it starts with the most vulnerable people, and in this case, essentially children, young women who are vulnerable for various reasons, that are set upon by groups that have a whole different idea about interactions between the sexes and apparently law enforcement. And a blind eye gets turned to it, which just encourages it. I mean, when the cost of that stuff gets paid by the vulnerable first, and that's always what happens, then legitimacy of the government itself starts cracking. What's the point? If you can't protect anybody, or if you self-select who you're going to protect based on the political whims of the day, no matter what they are, then who's going to support this? Who wants to stay involved with a governmental unit that's doing that? Who wants to contribute to that? And in the end, who isn't a little bit afraid of that? And even if you're one of the favored, it ought to bother you a little bit that it's happening, because what if you become the disfavored? What if there's a shift? What if another bunch gets in there and decides that, wait a second, you're the problem? There's nothing to hide behind when you do that. You've knocked all of the structures down. It's just the whims of the people in control and whatever political ideology that they're wedded to. We're going to see this in New York very starkly. I mean, we've seen it in other places, but New York, it's just coming fast and furious. So keep your eye on that. And let's remember, we don't want to